All right, the last video we discussed how the initial impulse was initiated by the receptors becoming more permeable to sodium ions. Now we're going to go into more detail about after that initial change in voltage, how is that change in voltage moving all the way along the sensory neuron to the central nervous system? And this applies to the relay neuron and motor neuron as well. But let's just think of it in terms of how did the change in the environment get to our brain in more detail. So yeah, once again, loads of key terms. We've already talked a bit about resting potential, so we'll go back into a bit more detail on that. We're going to talk about the sodium-potassium pump, active transport, electrochemical gradient, voltage-gated channels. So there's two. There's the sodium and the potassium channels. A process called depolarization, another process called repolarization, hyperpolarization, and a period called the refractory period. And this is important. It's the all or nothing principle. And this whole thing you're looking at here is called the action potential. So if you are wanting to read up more on this, then you search action potential. This is what it is. So we're going to go through all the events taking place. So in order for this impulse, whatever this impulse is, to move from your receptor to your central nervous system, the same events need to take place the whole way along the length of the axon of the neuron. So for this to work, a few things need to be set up. So the really important thing that has to happen first is a resting potential has to be set up. And the resting potential, if you remember the last video I said minus 70, this one it shows minus 60, but both answers are correct, so don't worry about the numbers too much, just as long as it's somewhere between minus 60 and minus 70. So how has the inside, so the inside is this green region, how has the inside of the axon become negative compared to the outside of the axon? You can see here this purple region is the membrane. There's the phospholipid bilayer. Why is the inside negative compared to the outside? Well, it's because of this protein pump here doing a really important job. It is pumping sodium ions out of the neuron. So it's pumping out positive ions, but strangely, it's pumping in other ions which are also positive. So surely if positive is being pumped in, how can it become negative? Well, it's all relative. The inside is negative compared to the outside because of this ratio. For every 3 sodium ions that go out, only 2 potassium ions are going in. So there's this 3 to 2 in positive charge means that the outside has an extra plus charge every time this happens. So this pump is working hard. It requires ATP, and therefore and also what's happening is because so much sodium is being pumped out, it's being pumped out against its concentration gradient. So this is an example of active transport. So now that loads of sodium ions have been pumped out, we have established the resting potential of minus 60 or minus 70 millivolts, whichever you want to say, it doesn't matter. Okay, so now it's ready to go. If now a stimulus takes place, for example, light enters the eye and the light receptors leak sodium ions, as more and more sodium ions leak, that's going to cause the voltage to become less negative to a point where it gets to this part here, which is about minus 55 millivolts. Minus 55 millivolts. There's our threshold level. And when that happens, you can see here the sodium ion channel opens. And when the sodium ion channel opens, all the sodiums which have been pumped out against their concentration gradient, they are going to naturally diffuse back in. And they're going to bring their positive charge. And we call this depolarization. So if we look on the graph here now, from here all the way up to here, the voltage is moving from -60 to -40 to 0 up to close to +40. So it's gone from being negative inside the axon of the neuron to positive. And we call this process here, let's do it here, depolarization. Depolarization is the diffusion of sodium ions into the neuron, causing the charge to become more positive. And it always, at this close to +40 millivolts, it doesn't go beyond that. It doesn't matter how big the stimulus is, whether it's a small little bit of light in the eye, or a big flashlight, or a big firework, or if we talk about sound, whether it's a very small sound that you can just about hear, or a big loud bang, the depolarization will be the same. It will only take the voltage up to +40 or within that region. And then it suddenly starts to drop back down, the voltage. So why is that happening? Well, at this very moment here, as we get to +40, these channels are voltage gated. So at -55, the sodium channel, voltage gated sodium channel, opens. When it gets to +40, the sodium channel will close. Therefore, no more sodium can diffuse in, so no more positive charge comes in. At the same time, another voltage gated channel opens. So if we look down here, the sodium channel has closed, and now the potassium channel has opened. And if the potassium channel is opening, you can see the potassium ions are now diffusing out. And they're diffusing out because if we go back to the beginning over here, the sodium potassium pump was actively transporting sodium against their concentration gradient out, and it was actively transporting potassium ions in against their concentration gradient. So there was this concentration gradient or electrochemical gradient happening here as well, and now they can diffuse out. And as they diffuse out, those potassium ions are taking the positive charge with them out of the neuron, out of the axon. So as they take their charge out, look what's happening inside the axon. On the inner part of the axon, the charge is beginning to become less positive and more negative. And we call this here repolarization. So this repolarization is only happening because when it got to +40, the sodium ion channel closed and the potassium ion channel opens, and therefore the potassiums were diffusing out. And then what happens is it's so effective with the potassium ions that diffuse now that they actually go even below the original resting potential, and we call this hyperpolarization. And that takes a little bit of time to recover. So you can see once it's gone below the original resting potential, the potassium channel has now closed. It's closed there. The sodium channel is closed. So the only way now we can return it back to this original voltage, which is what we back to the beginning, which is the resting potential, the sodium potassium pump is now being activated, and we start from the very beginning. Now this is good that this happens because of this delay in return it back to the resting potential. This is helping to prevent an impulse going the wrong direction. We only want it to go from the receptor to the central nervous system. So this is useful. Okay, so let's look at this again, just a bit more detail. So we've got the axon zoomed in. There's the outside, there's the inside. So this is already showing the resting potential has been established, because we can see that there's a positive charge on the outside because all the sodiums were pumped out and all the potassiums were pumped in with the sodium potassium pump, and that has created this potential difference. Now, if a stimulus has occurred over this direction over here somewhere, and this region begins to become more positive because sodium ions have been diffusing in previously from the early regions, we can see here now the sodium ion channels, the voltage gated sodium ion channels have opened, and the sodiums are beginning to diffuse in. And we call this depolarization. Now, if you look here, this sodium ion, it doesn't just stay in this region, it begins to diffuse to the next region here now. So the next parts of the axon, they're beginning to become less negative. And if you jump to this here now, this region here, eventually this reaches threshold level and the next sodium ion channel's open. And that continues. It's a bit like a Mexican wave, if you remember what they do in the stadiums, where this depolarization is going to cause a depolarization here, and then this depolarization will cause a depolarization here, and so on. So it's moving from one to next to next. An impulse is essentially depolarizations going one after the other, like the domino effect. So whilst this region here is depolarizing, it's important that the previous region of the axon returns back to normal. So you can see here that repolarization is happening, and eventually the sodium potassium pumps in this region will be activated, and it will return it back to normal. And this region here is going to cause another depolarization here, and whilst this is depolarizing, this will begin to repolarize, and this depolarization will cause depolarizing here, and this will repolarize. So it keeps this Mexican wave effect happening as we go along. Okay, so let's just, last thing, this is just a bit more emphasis on this all or nothing. Some people get confused. They think, oh, if there's a really, really big stimulus, then maybe this graph must shoot up to really high levels, like plus 100 millivolts. That's never going to happen. So how is it we're able to distinguish between a small stimulus, such as a quiet sound, and a loud sound? Well, it's all going to come down to the frequency as to how many of these action potentials happen. So if it was a quiet sound, if this just says this is just time, then the action potentials might have done this. That'd be a quiet sound. Whereas if it's a loud noise, the frequency is going to be much more obvious. And that is how our brain can detect differences between a big stimulus and a small stimulus. Loads and loads of key terms to use here. You've got to know the order of events taking place. So practice this. In the lesson, you're going to receive this same worksheet for you to be able to try and interpret it. So practice. In the description, I'm going to leave an animation for you to look at as well, which should help for you to get your head around this. Okay.